Okay, so it was very interesting that last question asked about animation, because leading into this is going to be looking at a lot of animation. I won't dwell long on these slides because we don't have a long time, but effectively I've been outside of archaeology for the past probably 6 years. I've still been working on archaeological content, but I haven't really been engaging with archaeological conferences, papers. I've been working heavily on the projects, but I haven't had the time to learn the technical side and the academic side. And something that I realised very early on when I was trying to get engaged with CGI was that I really had to commit fully to learn the processes and spend the time investment to contribute to the level that I kind of identified in the industry, which, as John says, is a lot of time investment. So, although I've contributed to heritage-based exhibitions and projects, and I've been present, my kind of academic footprint hasn't really developed over, say, the past 5 years. So that's something that, now that I feel I've achieved a good standard, I want to try and look back at and study why what I've done has been such a kind of journey for me. So as I said, I identified very early that to really develop myself quickly, I had to immerse myself in the CGI community. And the idea for this talk came because back in March, I went to an ECS game design course, and they were talking about protagonists, antagonists, non-diegetic, diegetic use of sounds and meaning. And I began to think, why aren't people in CGI talking about this? Why isn't this being discussed in the 3D world? When I see 3D visualizations, they tend to be very kind of static and matter of fact in the way they're presented, through rendering engines, physical accuracy, final gather solutions. There's lots of terminology, but there's not a lot of connection with the underlying creator or the auteur. So this is a great quote from Forte, where he says that the speed at which technology evolves is often greater than the ability of people in academia to keep up with, especially in terms of the industry, because you have people who've dedicated 20, 30 years to working in film, television, CGI, and they're only working on a selective part of that process. They might only be working as a lighting technician, they might only be working as a boom mic operator or an editor, and they're fulfilling part of a much wider production pipeline. And these are careers here, so it is very difficult to expect the academic world to just kind of peek into this without it really experiencing it and take from it all of the knowledge and processes that are required. It really requires people who are interested in multidiscipline to go out, like me and like Kate, who have come from other areas, or to really commit to doing that, and then to bring that knowledge back into archaeology and to say, look, this is what we've seen, this is how it works, and we can integrate this into archaeology, and we can develop the way of thinking. So with CGI, effectively, you're making a world from nothing. You're starting with nothing, you're creating a world, you're establishing the rules. But there are many artistic processes within that. And there are also many, many scientific processes in that as well. But the doors keep opening. When I first began working with CGI, I approached it in a very archaeological, methodological way. But I kept on finding that every time I opened a door, another 10 doors would appear. And I'd have to learn more and more and more stuff. And every time an extra door appeared, it just added more and more subjectivity and more choices to what I was then creating, in a way that it wasn't linear at all. Some processes were very scientific, others weren't. Others were highly stylized, others were highly compositing the look of how you create images. And everything formed a very complicated pipeline, especially out in the commercial world, where, as I say, people are dedicating decades of their lives to achieving a quality standard on just one of these parts. So the main thing that I realised very early on was that archaeologists aren't seeing the level of quality that is out there in the CGI world. So if you go to websites like Ronan Berkman, if you go and look at artists like Alex Roman, you'll see people who are creating fabulous images of architecture, which is very closely linked to lots of archaeological visualizations that are architectural in design, but they're not being presented in the same way. So here you can see a breakdown of materials, you can see him showing his Photoshop's file and the way that he's edited the Photoshop file to achieve a certain look. And you can just see a whole ton of breakdowns available on these sites where artists will go in and they'll say, this is what I've done, this is the level I've done it at, here's the level of my craft. And people will go and they'll laud it, they'll say, well, that was amazing, can you show me how you've done that? And they'll spread ideas. But I wasn't seeing this in CGI at the beginning. I wasn't seeing this way of presenting 3D at all. I was seeing people saying, I use this rendering engine because it's physically accurate. I use this solution because it's... and I just wanted to show you another example of it from the industry, if this will work. Hopefully it will. So the discourse that I was seeing in the public, in the commercial world, was completely flipped to the discourse I was seeing inside of archaeology. This is a CGI a trailer for Alex Roman's The Third and the Seventh. This is all CGI, and this is him at a very high level on his own, just creating amazing sequences of CGI and using them to communicate a building, an architectural building. I think I'll turn up. And obviously this is linked to, let me just stop this a second and put the sound on. Yeah, because it's, I've got it here. Yeah. And so obviously, this he is also acting as a, I think he said this was his first example where he was also creating a score of music for this as well. So on top of... So that's just a very tiny clip from The Third and the Seventh, which is probably one of his best well-known pieces, and that was from 2009, so that was 7 years ago now. And that I saw that when I was just beginning to get involved in archaeological visualization, and I was very curious about, why was this not being discussed? Why was this level of CGI not being shown in the archaeological world? There was nobody I could see who was working to that level. Yet people were talking about CGI as if they were at that level in craft. So their discourse did not match what I was seeing in the commercial world, and the way that the commercial artists were talking about it was completely different. So and this is another example of Marek Denko. This scene is incredible. This doesn't do it justice. It's a 10,000 resolution image, and you can zoom all the way into these. And this was a personal project of his that took, I think, a year or two. So what I started to talk about with the archaeologists is that it's not a mechanistic process. There are artists out there creating amazing things who are dedicating their lives to doing this. And there are even people offering courses in how to create shaders, how to create objects, how to create models, who are at the top level in that field. And so this is an example of Grant Warwick Shadable, which is a scene that is offered so that people can go in and test their different material types. And there's an entire workshop around just... People have paid $150 per course to sign up to this, to spend 6 weeks working with Alex, submitting their work, having him critique their work, send it back, and then have everyone together in a forum just looking at the different things that people come up with. And here you can see my version of that, and me working on the same principles. So it became very clear to me early on that there just was a disconnect between what was happening in the commercial world and what was happening, at least in how it was presented in academia. So the first project I worked on was looking at shadow work and trying to work out how light worked in spaces at Chatel. And so a photographic reference was taken, which is on the left, and I basically came up with a 3D representation of it on the right. But at this point in my process, I was just learning, I was just copying what I could see, and I was spending a lot of time focusing on one image, trying to replicate what that image was. And to that gain, a long time ago when I used to study martial arts, there was a concept called shuhari, which is that you learn, copy and repeat what somebody does, And then over time, the idea that you do something for 10,000 hours, and then you learn that skill, then you can start to apply innovations, then you can start to modify what you're being taught. And then eventually, the final stage is you've become so adept at communicating in that medium that you can break all forms of constraints, because it's like a natural language to you. That can apply maybe to music, to art. You get to the point where, and in CGI it's very important, because the technological restrictions for CGI are what halt that. To be able to really create what is in your mind in CGI, you need to overcome a lot of technological boundaries in terms of hardware, software, but also just learning so many different areas of expertise. So what I just wanted to show you again was the Shadowwork animation, and I will just talk through it afterwards. So this was effectively the first big animation I did for Chatao, and it was trying to put in some of the creative processes that I had kind of identified from these commercial artists. I'd looked at what they'd done, I'd seen the things that I liked, and I tried to say, why is their work so, why is it breaking so many boundaries? Why are so many people connecting with this work? And it was just their level of being able to create reality. And that wasn't something that the software could offer out of the box. That was something they had to work very hard to do, especially in relation to creating, to breaking that uncanny valley. Especially, that doesn't just apply to humans. It also applies to objects, to rooms, to the way you hold the camera. There's many things that you need to do to overcome the fact that you're presenting a fake reality. But at that level, you're then making a lot of creative processes and a lot of creative decisions that often don't get discussed. And so my current psychology is to try and impress that to the archaeology, to get my personality more into these processes and show that ultimately in CGI much of it is about control, and anywhere that control in creativity is very strong means that there are many options that you can go down. And so in CGI we have the modelling process, which is, again, one of those doors that you open, and many doors can offspring from that. I'd love to be able to speak in more depth, but I can see the time running down. Creating props on their own, individual items, objects, rooms, parts of the model. Then you have the texturing process, where you're taking information from archaeology. All of these are all subjective processes based on what archaeological material do you have, how are you going to translate that into the software, what skill level you're at so that you can take that information and represent it correctly. Developing shaders is a whole sub-classification. So how do you take that information, create a shader, make it look, and then also present the ambition of what the project wants. So for this, the project wanted the ability to have every single layer of paint have a different shader, so that you could change the red paint if you wanted to be metal. You wouldn't do it, but the possibility is there to change the properties of every single layer of paint. So we had to create a complicated shader map where we blended between many different layers of paint to the point where we had our original shaders driving that, so that now we can go into the model and we can make many different changes. That hasn't been done, but the opportunity is there to do it. So that was more a forward-thinking idea for this project. Creating textual information from images, much of that was taken from the site, and again this is a highly subjective workflow where the shaders aren't set in stone. There are different shaders, there are different renderers, there are different ways to approach the way that you do things. You can approach it from a physically accurate way, you can go based off of index of refraction of the object. There is a whole spectrum of ways you can approach every individual decision. And so blogging about these and putting these forward into the archaeological community is important to show not just the way that you're trying to convey, the message you're trying to convey, but the choices you've made in your own personal workflow. Because a lot of the constraints can also be time, cost, the size of the people you're working on, the amount of time you've got, the amount of information you've got, and that all kind of forms into an individual identity of what the archive you have and the workflow you're working through. And this is just an example of that in terms of texturing. This is something that I just show to master students when I begin to talk to them about texturing. When you're creating CGI, you're literally deconstructing the world. You're thinking about how the world works, how the objects react to light, how the human eye looks at things, and so you're effectively recreating reality. And so there's a lot of complicated processes and ideas, and some of them often need to be faked. Some of them you can't just brute force do because it would take you years. So part of it is also coming in subjectively as an artist and saying, how can I fake that process? So this is just an example of all the different levels of control that you have at the end for things like dust and shadows and camera depth of field. These are all things that, as an artist at the end of the process, you want to have control over, because if you commit to rendering something for 3 weeks and it's wrong, you don't have to go back and re-render it again for another 3 weeks. So you want to make sure that if you want to change the camera depth of field, you can do that. And so these all become a tool set for creating the look, the feel, the focus that can then be retrospectively looked at again if required. So part of what I began to think about was the idea of communication. And for me, working with CGI, it was the idea that communication was closely linked to craft, in that I could not communicate accurately what I wanted to communicate until I had learned a certain level of proficiency. So these are early images of some of my first models, and they're all done in the same software, but you can see there's a stark difference to the lighting and the modelling, and this is just a sketch from Portis of what I was trying to create. Now there's a stark difference between those and these. And these are, again, the first versions of this building that I did back in 2010, and these are some of the more recent ones that I did in 2015. And you can see that the development is, it's the same engine, it's the same renderers, they're both physically accurate, they all have the same buzzwords, but they look very different. And they look very different because I've changed as an artist. And that is the real difference, is people that look at the software packages taking the buzzwords out of the box, it's almost as if they've never really got past that first stage of that Japanese expression. They've never really got past the stage of replication, of looking at what the box can do initially. They've never managed to make these kind of changes. And I don't feel like I'm at the end of that. I don't feel like I can use this naturally in the same way that these professional artists can. I'm probably somewhere in the middle where I'm beginning to innovate on what I've repeated, but there are still isolated challenges that I haven't overcome. Things like water, things like fire, things like animation, and that can be hardware related, or it can just be artistically related. Another example of early Chattelberg renders, and then going through to some of the more recent ones. There is a development there also in the archaeological development, in terms of going backwards and forwards in discussions with Ian and looking at Mel Art's work and looking at the new classifications of the shrines to history houses and things like that from Chateau. So there's a whole kind of maelstrom of different things happening. And yeah, again, if you're able to talk about auteur theory from a camera and a film perspective, then in this instance, you're doing the camera and film perspective, but you're also creating the world. So there's a whole set of rules in terms of how you're creating that world, what parameters you're making, and then what kind of choices you're making that affects the link up with that traditional look at auteur theory. So then I began thinking of this idea of expression and craft, and that you have, expression on one side, and it's important that we recognise expression across the board, But then it's also important that we keep recognising craft, because there are kind of twofold reasons to this. As an archaeologist doing CGI, I feel like it's made me a better archaeologist. I feel like my ability to look at things has changed, and especially dealing with the archaeology and the data, being able to come in and deal with huge amounts of data and translate that into an image that brings many different team members together and represents their research has impacted upon me. And this is a good example of the knowledge of craft, so that when we were building the Portis models, we had Janet Delane come in from Oxford, who has experience as an engineer, and she used her engineering experience to go in and say, this wouldn't stand, this would stand. And so we cross-referenced all of our work with a series of experts in their relevant fields so that we could get their information into the CGI models. So I think, just in conclusion, there are kind of two areas that I identified, and this is all very early discussions. The first is interpreting the past. Being a creative allows you to look at things and identify processes that might have happened in archaeology that you might not necessarily be able to recognise. If you have built houses, you can recognise the kind of things people do, the type of ways they might cut corners, or A good example is Pat Tanner, who's a boat builder. He came in and he said, I can build boats, and I can tell you that what you have labelled as being degradation is actually a cut that many boat builders make to stabilise the ship. So these are kind of experience-based things that you get from dipping out of archaeology into another area and then coming back in. But then the other side of it, as we discussed today, is also the ability to communicate to the present. So it's the ability to, pick your audience, connect with them, deliver narrative, add granularity to the work you're doing, and unite ranging ideas. And claiming authorship is important because it's, in my opinion, our responsibility to do so. I don't expect archaeology in general to know what I know. That's why I've gone out and done that, so I can come back and say to archaeologists, I've dedicated my time to learning this industry, and now it's my responsibility to come back and say, I don't want to hide in the same way that I've seen people hide before. I want to be honest about what I'm doing and share what I'm doing. So I feel like to truly be multidisciplinary, you should be equally proficient in multiple areas, and it should be the combination of theory and practice. And to do that in CGI, to really impart your personality onto the work you're doing, requires a lot of knowledge-based craft ideas and transfer. And I think we've run out of time, have we not? Okay, all right. So then the other area that I was kind of, in terms of not just archaeology, but in general, is that through working through this atmosphere where I can basically recreate pretty much anything now, I've started to identify ways this is being done in popular culture. And I've started to, for a long time, photorealism in archaeology was a bit of a demonisation in that people would say, why should we make things so realistic? But they were focusing on something that I feel, archaeology never achieved. They never achieved true photorealism, as we saw. There were no visualizations to the level of Alex Roman or Grant Warwick or these people in commercial. And it's also a very clear example of most people aren't stupid enough to know that, if you see a reconstruction, most people will say, well, I know it's a reconstruction. But then they won't question things that happen all the time. There are things that are happening in the wider world in terms of the way that we see in popular culture that are being edited, that are more mundane. The people using the backdrop of film sets because they can't afford to film there, or people dressing Vancouver up as a different type of city. Things are happening all the time in popular culture that people just don't question because to them it looks realistic. But most of the media we're seeing is being manipulated in some way. And creating realistic CGI was an acceptance of the fact that there are trends and there are ways that people project stuff that is almost a cultural and social learning. They've grown up with this visual image, such as colour grading, for example, from films. If you examine films, there is a very distinct pattern in the way that they colour grade films, especially in Hollywood, ever since Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, when they decided to start colour grading films. It's all become basically blue and orange. And here's a good example of UKIP's badly photoshopped library, where they've faked him being in a library because you can see that there's a nice kind of fake Photoshop slice there with a book. So, and we all know about the way that the manipulation of images affects people's self-esteem and the way that they project their identity. And this is just something that, creating the past has widened my view to what is edited everywhere, not just in archaeology. And so I feel like part of the message from my side is that people should be questioning everything, not just the really visible reconstructions, but everything they're seeing. And these are just a few final images about how the next kind of logical step from this is to take these 3D models, to take these personalities who are getting to these levels of craft and to really integrate them into a working resource where, again, their personality is there. Part of my idea to try and separate myself out, to take responsibility, was to make my own company, was to put everything I had on the front page of that company, to really put it out there so that if anyone saw it, they had a unified place they could come to and they could ask me questions and they could say, I wasn't lost inside the academic structure to the point where people didn't really know who to email, how they could approach me. I really wanted it to just be, I see your image, I want to ask a question, and I want to come to you, so that then I can feel like, even if my personality isn't at the point of being to the level of those commercial artists, I have somewhere where they can come to. And yeah, I think that's really the thing.